بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to welcome you all to another episode of After the Prophet, brought to you by the Ahlul Bayt American Society and Tasneem Institute. So we've been discussing the Khilafah of Abu Bakr and the events that transpired after the death of the Prophet. And we've essentially concluded that the Khilafah of Abu Bakr was secured through a combination of persuasion and pressure. While a small number of people remained firm in their resistance, most of the inhabitants of Medina either submitted or remained silent. However, we have to keep in mind that Medina represents only a small fraction of the wider Islamic world at the time. The question now is, how did the rest of Arabia respond to the Khilafah of Abu Bakr? Did they accept his leadership, or was there dissent among the Muslims who lived outside of Medina? Now, when you look at the historical records, you find that in the broader Arabian Peninsula, several tribes broke away from the new central authority in Medina. In fact, many of these tribes ended up following individuals who actually claimed to be prophets. Now, these were not merely religious movements. They were essentially bids for religious and political power. And many of these false prophets actually emerged towards the end of the Prophet's life. You have individuals like Al-Aswad Al-Ansi, Tulayh ibn Khuwaylid, Musaylim al-Kadhab. These individuals emerged as leaders of these rebellions. They claimed divine inspiration and divine authority. So you have this phenomenon of false prophets gaining traction after the death of the Prophet. Additionally, what you find in the historical records is that some of the major tribes that lived outside of Medina, they essentially renounced their allegiance to the central government in Medina. Tribes like Banu Asad, the tribe of Ghatafan, the tribe of Kinda, of Rabi'a, of Bani Hanifa, all of these groups refused to recognize the legitimacy of the new government in Medina. Now, oftentimes what happens is that these dissenters, when you study the period of Abu Bakr's Khilafah, they are all given kind of this blanket term. They're referred to as apostates. And perhaps one of the most defining legacies of Abu Bakr's Khilafah is what is known as the Ridda Wars, which translates as the Apostasy Wars. But one has to ask, a student of Islamic history has to ask the question, were these truly apostasy wars, or were these military conflicts that essentially were civil wars, which were basically struggles for power? Now, when you look at the Ridda Wars, what you find is that the so-called apostasy movements did not really begin after the death of the Prophet. Many of these false prophets emerged during the lifetime of the Prophet. If you look at figures like Musaylama, if you look at Tulayha, these are individuals who claimed nubuwah during the lifetime of the Prophet. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he dealt with them through letters, through confrontation, and in some cases through military action. In fact, Musaylama, towards the end of the Prophet's life, he actually sends a letter to the Prophet where he claims that he has a share in the prophethood. And of course, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he sent an army to fight against Tulayha, who was another claimant to prophethood. Now, with the death of the Prophet, rebels and tribal leaders, they saw an opportunity to assert their autonomy, or to at least challenge the new government. And the most dangerous of these movements were those tribes who were actually geographically close to Medina. So the Ridda Wars during the reign of Abu Bakr are often framed as apostasy wars. But the reality is that when you dig deeper into the historical accounts, you find that these wars were not just wars against unbelief, but rather they were civil struggles over legitimacy, over power and leadership in the post-prophetic Muslim community. Now, one of the most critical insights into the so-called Ridda Wars, because the word Ridda comes from the word irtidad, basically it means to apostate, is that when you look at the kutub, with the books of history of the early Islamic period, you find that not all of the tribes that Abu Bakr fought against were apostates in the theological sense. Now, there's no doubt that there were some during the reign of Abu Bakr who had followed the false prophets that we mentioned, but there were others who were actually devout Muslims, who believed in the oneness of God, who believed in the messengerhood of the Prophet, but they simply refused to pay zakat to the new leadership. Not because they rejected the obligation of zakat, but their refusal to give zakat to Abu Bakr was a political statement rejecting the authority of Abu Bakr as the Khalifa. I want to share with you a narration that we have in Sahih al-Bukhari, which is reported by Abu Hurairah, to give you an idea that those who Abu Bakr was fighting, they were not all apostates in the sense that they had abandoned Islam. Many of them were being fought for simply not paying their zakat to the new Khalifa. So Abu Hurairah reports, قال لما توفي النبي صلى الله عليه وآله واستخلف أبو بكر وكفر من كفر من العرب قال عمر يا أبا بكر كيف تقاتل الناس وقد قال رسول الله أمرت أن أقاتل الناس حتى يقول لا إله إلا الله. When the Prophet passed away and Abu Bakr was appointed as his successor, and some of the Arabs reverted to disbelief, so there were some Muslims who had apostated, Umar, he says to Abu Bakr, how can you fight the people when the Messenger of Allah said, I was commanded to fight the people until they say, La ilaha illallah. فَمَنْ قَالَ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ عَصَمَ مِنِّي مَالَهُ وَنَفْسَهُ إِلَّا بِحَقِّهِ وَحِسَابُهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ. The Prophet says, Umar, he says that the Prophet said, I was commanded to fight against the people until they concede to the oneness of God. And if they say La ilaha illallah, their wealth and their lives are protected from me except by its due right, and his reckoning is with Allah. So here Umar, in this narration from Bukhari, is basically questioning Abu Bakr. You know, how are you justifying going to war against people who say La ilaha illallah? So here Umar is highlighting that some of the wars that were fought were waged against individuals who did not technically apostate. So what is the answer of Abu Bakr? قال أبو بكر والله لأقاتلن من فرق بين الصلاة والزكاة فإن الزكاة حق المال. Abu Bakr, he says, I will certainly fight those who separate between prayer and zakat, who basically argue that, salah is important but zakat is not. For zakat is the due right upon wealth. So then Abu Bakr, he says, لو منعوني عناقا كان يؤدونها إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله لقاتلتهم على منعها. So Abu Bakr, he says, if they withhold even a young she-goat that they used to give to the Messenger of God, I will fight them for withholding it. So here, Abu Bakr is stating that I am fighting even against those who refuse to give me their zakat. Now the question is, was there a precedent in the life of the Prophet where he goes to war with people who did not pay zakat? Did he take their lives? Did he kill those who refused to give him zakat? Abu Bakr is saying that I will fight against those who refuse to give me their zakat. So it's not that they don't believe in zakat, but they have to recognize me as the rightful Khalifa, and they have to give their religious taxes to me. So these narrations like this, they lead us to an important conclusion. And that is that the Ridda Wars were not simply a clash between belief and disbelief. If they were a clash between belief and disbelief, why would Umar question Abu Bakr and ask him, how are you fighting against people who say La ilaha illallah? This goes to show that many of the groups that were being fought against by Abu Bakr were in fact Muslims. So the Ridda Wars were a tangled web of political resistance, tribal autonomy, and economic control, and in some cases, theological deviance. By collapsing all of these groups into a single category of apostasy, Abu Bakr sought to legitimize the suppression of dissenters under a religious banner. When you study this period of Islamic history, when you study the Ridda Wars, the real tragedy is that the diverse motivations of these tribes were flattened into a single narrative, one that served the political interests of Abu Bakr, that to paint all of them with the same brush, that anyone who resisted the Khilafah of Abu Bakr was deemed a kafir, deemed as a murtad. And this is perhaps the first time in the history of Islam where you see excessive usage of takfir. So takfir used to be, someone who leaves their religion, disbelieves in God and His Messenger, rejects the obligation of the fundamentals of the faith. But now, Abu Bakr is extending the meaning of irtidad to include anyone who doesn't give him zakat and anyone who does not recognize his khilafah. So there is compelling historical evidence that many of the tribes accused of apostasy after the death of Rasulullah were not actually rejecting Islam. Their disputes were not over aqa'id. They were not over the obligation of salah or the obligation of zakat. But ultimately and essentially, the rejection of these tribes goes back to the idea of who has the legitimate right to lead the Muslim community. And many of these tribes, they viewed the outcome of Saqifa as unjust and refused to pay allegiance to Abu Bakr, seeing the rightful leader as Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, who was appointed in Ghadir Khum. If you look at the historical accounts, the historical reports tell us that tribes like Banu Asad explicitly stated, during the reign of Abu Bakr, that They accept zakat as a religious duty, but they refused to pay zakat to the government because they saw the government as illegitimate. So their refusal to pay zakat to Abu Bakr was political in nature. It was a form of political resistance. Yet because they raised arms or withheld allegiance to Abu Bakr, they were labeled as apostates. And this tactic allowed the new regime under Abu Bakr to frame a civil dispute as a religious rebellion. And this is what allowed them to justify the military action against the dissenters. So the narrative of apostasy was in many cases a political tool used to eliminate opposition. The refusal to obey Abu Bakr was treated as equivalent to rejecting the Prophet ﷺ, even though the dissenters continued to affirm Islam. Now, when you study the historical material that we have on Hurub al-Ridda, you find that it truly represents one of the darkest chapters in the early history of Islam. And it was not only dark because of the political manipulation of apostasy, where the label of apostasy was being attached to any group that refused to recognize the Khilafah of Abu Bakr or refused to pay him zakat. But what was truly tragic was the violent suppression of dissent through brutal and extrajudicial killings. After branding many of the tribes outside of Medina who refused to surrender their zakat to Abu Bakr, after labeling them as apostates, Abu Bakr decides to send Khalid ibn al-Walid to enforce obedience, not through dialogue, but through the sword. I'll give you one case study to give you an idea of what actually was happening during the Ridda Wars. So if you look at the case of the tribe of Banu Yarbu'. Banu Yarbu' was a tribe that lived outside of Medina, and one of the most prominent figures, the chief of this tribe, was Malik ibn Nuwayra. So he was the chief, and he was the one who would collect zakat from his tribe, and he would give it to the Prophet. Now, the incident relating to Malik ibn Nuwayra is interesting because historians are nearly unanimous that Malik ibn Nuwayra, that the tribe of Malik ibn Nuwayra, Banu Yarbu', did not apostate. They actually remained on Islam. We have a narration in Tarikh al-Tabari, and this is found in numerous historical sources. Tabari reports, and also Ibn Ishaq in his seerah mentions, that Abu Bakr had instructed his armies that if they pass through a settlement, if they pass through a village, and they hear the adhan, they were to refrain from attacking the people. If they hear the adhan, they have to be very careful. They have to ensure that they're not fighting against Muslims. They would have to inquire and question the people of that village. When Khalid ibn al-Walid's forces passed by the dwellings of Banu Yarbu', they did in fact hear the adhan. So after they heard the adhan, they initially refrained from any form of aggression. However, at night, Khalid ibn al-Walid authorized an army to raid the village. So the villagers were basically caught off guard, and as they were being attacked, they took up arms in defense, but they were quickly overpowered by the forces of Khalid ibn al-Walid. Now, when questioned, both Khalid's soldiers and the villagers declared themselves as Muslims. So you have two sides, the forces of Khalid ibn al-Walid and the tribe of Banu Yarbu', both of them are claiming to be Muslims. So after some discussion, the villagers, they disarmed and they decided to all pray, to offer a congregational prayer. The time of Salah had set in, and the tribe of Banu Yarbu' stands for Salah. The army of Khalid ibn al-Walid, they also stand for Salah. So you have these group of these two groups of Muslims who are basically standing for Salah now. Now, despite these clear signs of their faith, so it's very clear that Banu Yarbu' had not apostated, they're standing for prayer. Even after witnessing their Salah and hearing their adhan, Khalid makes a unilateral decision and he gives the order to his men to execute Banu Yarbu'. Now, one of the men who was with Khalid ibn al-Walid, Abu Qutad al-Ansari, he was a companion of the Prophet, he objected strongly to this. And he testified that the tribe of Banu Yarbu', they were Muslims and they had prayed. And he was so disturbed by the brutal killing of Banu Yarbu' that he swore not to ever be involved in anything with Khalid ibn al-Walid. Now, Khalid, he dismissed the objections, claiming that their refusal to pay Zakat was enough reason for them to be executed. Now, the narration says that when news reaches Medina, when Umar ibn al-Khattab hears about what Khalid did to the tribe of Banu Yarbu', he was appalled and he actually condemned the act. Now, Malik ibn Nuwayra, of course, being the chief of the tribe, he was with them, he was praying, Khalid saw him pray, but still Khalid ibn al-Walid decides to execute Malik ibn Nuwayra. So Malik ibn Nuwayra, a companion of the Prophet, the chief of Banu Yarbu', and he was not executed, as a result of a battlefield confrontation. He was executed, and his execution was a deliberate execution after his tribe had been tricked into laying down their weapons. They had been led to believe that they were safe, but Khalid did not simply stop at ordering their deaths. He went further, committing two deeply disturbing acts. If you look at Tabari, and if you look at other historical sources, you find that Khalid ibn al-Walid mutilates the body of Malik ibn Nuwayra. And he actually beheads Malik, and I hate to say this, but this is what we find in the books of history. He actually takes the severed head of Malik, he takes the skull of Malik ibn Nuwayra, and he uses it as a cooking pot lid. Now, this gruesome act this gruesome act of desecration was shocking, even by the standards of that time. So he mutilates the body of Malik ibn Nuwayra, and of course we know that in Islam it's forbidden to mutilate the body of a human being. Furthermore, after killing Malik ibn Nuwayra, Khalid ibn al-Walid, he took Malik's wife, who was renowned and well known for her physical beauty. He takes her as a captive, and after ordering the execution of Malik, he actually has sexual relations with her on that same night. So he essentially rapes the wife of Malik ibn Nuwayra. And it's unfortunate, my dear brothers and sisters, that with this type of history, Khalid ibn al-Walid today is hailed by most Muslims as the unsheathed sword of God, Sayfullah al-Maslul. But how is it that we turn a blind eye to these atrocities? Now the question is, what was Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam doing during the Ridda Wars? Now it's important to note here that the Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen takes a very noble stance, during this period. Number one, as we've mentioned, despite the coup against Ali ibn Abi Talib and the attack on his household, his political, in addition to his political and social marginalization, he does not retaliate against the new government. He doesn't take any action against those who wronged him. Instead, he remains silent and committed to preserving the core of Islam. As for his second noble stance, you find that Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam did not exploit the Saqifa government's preoccupation by confronting it during the turmoil caused by the false prophets. So Amir al-Mu'mineen doesn't take advantage of the fact that Abu Bakr is busy fighting against the false prophets and these various tribes. He doesn't take advantage of the preoccupation to form his own rebellion against the government. Rather, according to the historical records, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam supported them in their battles against the rebels. As we said, some of these tribes had actually apostated, some of them had followed false prophets, and some reports indicate that Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam even actively participated in the defense of Medina during the assault of Tulayha ibn Khuwaylid al-Asadi when he tried to attack the city of Medina. So Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, when he saw that Islam is under threat, that these rebels were launching attacks on Medina, he intervened. Now I want to conclude with this final statement that we have from Amir al-Mu'mineen, where he speaks about this period, the period of the Riddah. If you look at Nahjul Balagha, letter 62, the Imam alayhi salam, in a letter that he writes to Malik al-Ashtar, he explains the role that he played during the Khilafah of Abu Bakr. Letter 62 of Nahjul Balagha says, وَمِن كِتَابٍ لَهُ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ إِلَى أَهْلِ مِصْرِ مَعَ مَالِكِ الْأَشْتَرِ لَمَّا وَلَّاهُ إِمَارَتَهَا. From a letter of his to the people of Egypt, sent with Malik al-Ashtar when he appointed him as their governor. أما بعد فإن الله سبحانه بعث محمدا صلى الله عليه وآله نذيرا للعالمين ومهيمنا على المرسلين. As for what follows, the Imam says, for God, the glorified, sent Muhammad as a warner to all of the worlds and as a guardian over the messengers. فلما مضى تنازع المسلمون الأمر من بعده. When the Prophet passed away, the Muslims disputed the leadership after him. فوالله ما كان يلقى في روعي ولا يخطر ببالي أن العرب تزعج هذا الأمر من بعده عن أهل بيته. Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says, by Allah, it never occurred to me, nor did it cross my mind, that the Arabs would wrest this matter of leadership away from his family after him. ولا أنهم منحوه عني من بعده فما راعني إلا انثيال الناس على فلان يبايعون. And then the Imam says, and I never thought that the people would withhold the Khilafah from me. After the various statements of the Prophet, after Ghadir Khum, it never occurred to me that the people would abandon the instructions of the Prophet in such a dramatic way. And then he says, what shocked me was seeing people rushing to pledge allegiance to so-and-so, meaning Abu Bakr. So the Imam says, I never imagined that the people would take the Khilafah away from Ahlul Bayt. And I was shocked that people were rushing to give allegiance to Abu Bakr. فَأَمْسَكْتُ يَدِي. So I withheld my hand. I did not unsheath my sword. حَتَّى رَأَيْتُ رَاجِعَةَ النَّاسِ قَدْ رَجَعَتْ عَنِ الْإِسْلَامِ. The Imam says, I did not draw my sword. I followed the instructions of the Prophet. But when did the Imam draw his sword? He says, so I withheld my hand until I saw that many people were turning back from Islam. يدعون إلى محق دين محمد صلى الله عليه وآله, calling to the erasure of the religion of Muhammad صلى الله عليه وآله. فخشيت إن لم أنصر الإسلام وأهله أن أرى فيه ثلما أو هدما تكون المصيبة به علي أعظم من فوت ولايتكم. The Imam says, I feared that if I did not rise to support Islam and its people, if I didn't draw my sword and fight against these rebels and these false prophets during the Khilafah of Abu Bakr, as we said, some of them were indeed apostates, but there were many who Abu Bakr fought who were not apostates. Amir al-Mu'mineen, he participated in fighting against the real apostates, the followers of the false prophets. He said, I feared that if I did not rise to support Islam and its people, I would witness a breach or the destruction of the religion, something whose calamity upon me would be greater than the loss of your leadership. التي إنما هي متاع أيام قلائل. This khilafah is nothing but the fleeting possession of a few days. يزول منها ما كان كما يزول السراب أو كما يتقشع السحاب. What is in it, what is in this khilafah, it vanished like a mirage fades away or like clouds disperse. فنهضت في تلك الأحداث. So I rose up during those events. I rose up during the khilafah of Abu Bakr. I fought against those apostates. I fought against those who were trying to erase the memory of this religion. حتى زاح الباطل وزهق. And I rose up during those events until falsehood was pushed aside and perished. So in conclusion, my dear brothers and sisters, the Ridda Wars occurred during the Khilafah of Abu Bakr. And while there were some tribes who had apostated, who followed the footsteps of false prophets, many of these tribes were labeled as apostates simply for refusing to pay allegiance to Abu Bakr and refusing to pay him zakat. So one of the ways in which political dissent was crushed during the reign of Abu Bakr is that anyone who refused to recognize Abu Bakr was simply labeled as an apostate. And as I mentioned, this is the first time in the early history of Islam where the dangerous precedent of takfir is being used. And as we will see when we study the later periods of Islamic history, how catastrophic this practice was in causing the bloodshed of people who were innocent. Inshallah, in our next episode, we'll speak about the end of Abu Bakr's Khilafah and we'll speak about the rise of the Khilafah of Umar ibn al-Khattab and the role that Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam played during these years. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us and guide us. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.